Something happened during a Christmas briefing that Washington did not expect and did not want. Karoline Leavitt stepped up calmly, then dropped a line that instantly changed the room. No names at first, no accusations, just a quiet reference to sealed 2020 files that were never meant to resurface. And suddenly, Barack Obama's shadow was back in the conversation. The real shock isn't what she said, it's why these questions are being asked now, and who stayed silent afterward. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Now let's dive into what really happened. Stop everything. This was not how the day was supposed to go. The room was decorated for Christmas. Reporters expected light questions, seasonal remarks, and the usual political small talk before everyone headed home for the holidays. It was meant to be routine, festive, calm, and ultimately forgettable. Then Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the podium. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Cameras were rolling. Pens were ready. A few reporters glanced at their notes, already half checked out. But within seconds, something shifted. Her posture stiffened. Her tone dropped. The holiday atmosphere vanished. And then she said it. The American people deserve to know what happened in 2020. The room went silent. You could almost hear reporters stop breathing. No smiles. No laughter. No Christmas cheer. Just shock. Because everyone knew what that sentence implied, and more importantly, who it pointed toward. Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone outright. She didn't even mention names at first. Instead, she did something far more effective. She introduced doubt. She claimed that previously sealed documents, long kept away from public view, were now under review. According to her, these files raised serious questions about actions taken during the final months of what she described as the Obama political network's ongoing influence. That phrasing was deliberate. She wasn't talking about a presidency. She was talking about a system, former officials, advisors, and institutional power that, she suggested, never truly left Washington after Obama's time in office ended. And that's when the tension thickened. Leavitt emphasized that these documents were not rumors or internet speculation. She referred to them as internal materials, communications and records that had been classified, restricted, and kept out of public discussion for years. She didn't explain everything. In fact, she explained very little. But what she did say was enough. She stressed that the review was ongoing, that conclusions had not yet been finalized, and yet she made it clear that the questions alone were significant. Her calm delivery made it even more unsettling. This wasn't a fiery speech. This wasn't a political rant. This was measured, controlled, almost clinical. And that's exactly why it hit so hard. Viewers watching at home could sense it. This was intentional, prepared, and calculated. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of the briefing spread across platforms at lightning speed. Supporters leaned in, convinced that something massive was finally coming to light. Critics pushed back just as fast, accusing Leavitt of fear-mongering and vague insinuations without proof. But both sides agreed on one thing. This was not normal. Reporters scrambled to ask follow-up questions. Who authorized the review? What agencies were involved? Why now? Leavitt answered selectively, repeating that transparency mattered and that the American people had a right to clarity about their recent history. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. A reporter asked directly whether these claims involved Barack Obama. Leavitt paused. She didn't accuse him. She didn't defend him either. Instead, she said that the documents reference individuals and networks connected to past administrations, and that further review would determine responsibility. That pause said everything, because by then, the name was already everywhere. Supporters leaned forward, believing they were witnessing the opening chapter of a long-hidden story. Critics froze, worried about the implications of reopening wounds from one of the most divided moments in modern American history. And one name echoed louder than any other, not because it was spoken, but because it didn't need to be. Barack Obama. This wasn't just a Christmas briefing anymore. It was the beginning of a political storm, and everyone in that room knew it. As the briefing continued, it became clear that Karoline Leavitt wasn't speaking off the cuff. She was pointing towards something specific, something buried, According to Leavitt, the documents at the center of the controversy were not newly created. They had existed for years, locked away deep inside federal archives, classified under strict national security protocols. Internally, she claimed, some officials have referred to them as the 2020 coup files, a phrase that alone sent shockwaves across political media. That label immediately raised eyebrows. Leavitt explained that these files were not a single document, but a collection of materials, allegedly including internal communications between high-level officials, intelligence briefings circulated during the election period, records of political coordination during the 2020 election cycle. She was careful with her language. She did not describe their full contents. She did not claim they proved wrongdoing. Instead, she emphasized that their existence and secrecy demanded explanation. And then she asked the questions that changed everything. Why were these documents classified for so long? Who approved keeping them hidden from public view? And most importantly, why are they resurfacing now? Those questions lingered in the air. Leavitt made it clear that she was not accusing Barack Obama directly of criminal activity. In fact, she avoided naming him in that context altogether. But that restraint was intentional. Rather than making bold accusations, she let the implications speak for themselves. She suggested that the files point towards something more complex, a system of unelected officials, political operatives, and institutional actors who may have played a role in shaping narratives during one of the most divisive elections in American history. Her claim wasn't about ballots or voting machines. It was about influence. According to Leavitt, the documents allegedly suggest that certain individuals may have worked behind the scenes to guide investigations, steer public perception, and apply institutional pressure, all without appearing on a ballot themselves. That distinction mattered, because if true, it wouldn't be a story about left versus right. It would be a story about who actually holds power. At this point, the briefing room was fully locked in. Reporters leaned forward. Phones buzzed. Producers backstage were already rewriting headlines. Leavitt emphasized that these files were classified under national security rules, a designation usually reserved for matters of foreign threats or intelligence operations. That alone raised another uncomfortable question. Why would election-related materials require that level of secrecy? She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she reminded the audience that classification can sometimes be used not just to protect the nation, but to protect institutions from scrutiny. That line drew immediate reactions online, with supporters praising her candor and critics accusing her of undermining trust. Then came the sentence that would dominate social media for the rest of the day. This isn't about party. This is about power. It was short, calm, unemotional, and it landed like a hammer. Within minutes, clips of that line were everywhere, replayed, reposted, debated. Some viewers saw it as a long overdue challenge to the political elite. Others saw it as a vague but dangerous insinuation. But no one ignored it, because that sentence reframed the entire conversation. It suggested that the real divide wasn't Republican versus Democrat, but insiders versus the public, institutions versus transparency. Leavitt closed the section by stating that reviews were ongoing and that further disclosures would depend on declassification decisions. She gave no timeline, no guarantees, just a promise that the questions would not be buried again. And with that, the mystery deepened. The files weren't released. No names were officially named. No conclusions were announced. Yet the damage or the awakening, depending on who you ask, was already done. Because once people start asking why something was hidden, it becomes impossible to pretend it never existed. And the story of the files that weren't supposed to surface was only just beginning. Here's where the story truly ignites. Up to this point, Karoline Leavitt had spoken in general terms. Documents, institutions, unanswered questions. But now, she shifted the focus to something far more sensitive. Influence. Leavitt suggested that while Barack Obama was no longer president in 2020, his political shadow never left Washington. According to her framing, power doesn't disappear when a term ends. It moves. It embeds itself. She pointed to former advisors, intelligence officials, and political allies who continue to hold key positions across major institutions, from federal agencies to advisory roles and think tanks. People who, while no longer elected, still had the ability to shape decisions, narratives, and priorities. This wasn't a claim about a single person giving orders. It was a claim about a network. And that distinction was crucial. Leavitt never used the word coup outright. She didn't need to. By describing influence operating quietly, through institutions rather than public speeches, she allowed listeners to draw their own conclusions. That made the argument far more powerful and far more controversial. Instead of accusing anyone of direct wrongdoing, she framed the issue as institutional manipulation, decisions made behind closed doors, pressure applied subtly, narrative shaped not by voters, but by those who never appear on a ballot. By doing this, Leavitt walked a very careful line, careful enough to avoid outright accusations, but bold enough to provoke a national debate. And the reaction was immediate. Critics fired back within minutes. Political commentators and former officials dismissed the briefing as a distraction from current issues, a calculated political stunt, a dangerous rewriting of recent history. Some accused Leavitt of deliberately invoking Obama's name to inflame division. Others argued that reopening debates about 2020 would only deepen mistrust and instability. But supporters saw something entirely different. They believed this was a rare moment where someone was finally naming the unspoken reality of American politics, that power often exists beyond elections, beyond headlines, beyond accountability. To them, Leavitt wasn't attacking a man. She was challenging a system. Cable news networks went into overdrive. Panels ran long past their scheduled time, with analysts arguing over whether influence without office should be considered legitimate or dangerous. Legal experts debated the meaning of institutional authority. Political strategists argued about timing and intent. And then came the online reaction. Hashtags began trending worldwide within hours. Some praised Leavitt for speaking truth to power. Others accused her of undermining democratic norms. Clips of the briefing were slowed down, dissected, and replayed millions of times. Yet through all of it, one detail stood out. Obama himself did not respond. No statement, no press release, no social media post. And that silence only fueled the fire, because his name was everywhere, dominating headlines, panel discussions, and online debates. Even though he never addressed the claims directly, for supporters of Leavitt, the silence felt telling. For critics, it was proof that the claims weren't worth engaging. Either way, the effect was the same. The story grew bigger. What began as a Christmas briefing had turned into a full-scale political earthquake, not because of new evidence released, but because of how power was being reframed. This wasn't about left versus right anymore. It was about insiders versus outsiders, influence versus accountability, visibility versus silence. And by placing Obama's legacy within that conversation, even indirectly, Leavitt had touched one of the most sensitive nerves in modern American politics. Whether people agreed with her or not, one thing was clear. Once you start questioning who holds power after elections end, there is no easy way to put that question back to rest. And the aftershocks were only beginning. Timing matters. And this timing was impossible to ignore. Releasing a message like this during Christmas week was not random, and Karoline Leavitt made sure everyone understood that. While most political briefings slowed down for the holidays, she did the opposite. She leaned into the moment. Christmas is usually a pause, a time for reflection, forgiveness, and stepping away from conflict. And that's exactly why this briefing landed so differently. Leavitt framed the moment as symbolic, not strategic. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's inconvenient. That line wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. By choosing Christmas week, she shifted the tone from political combat to moral reckoning. This wasn't presented as an attack on opponents. It was framed as a responsibility, something that had to be said regardless of how uncomfortable it made people feel. And that framing changed everything. Instead of the usual left versus right shouting matches, the public reaction moved in a different direction. People weren't just arguing politics anymore. They were asking deeper questions. Questions like, can institutions be trusted to police themselves? Has the media been selective about what it investigates? And are elections influenced in ways the public never sees? These weren't fringe discussions. They were happening everywhere. In comment sections, on podcasts, on talk shows, and at dinner tables during holiday gatherings. Even people who openly disagreed with Leavitt found themselves pausing, because something about her delivery didn't fit the stereotype. She didn't sound reckless. She didn't sound emotional. She didn't sound like someone chasing attention. She sounded prepared. Her calm delivery stood out immediately. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures, just deliberate pacing and carefully chosen words. Each pause felt intentional, as if she wanted viewers to think before reacting. That restraint mattered. In a media environment filled with exaggeration and instant outrage, Leavitt's refusal to overclaim made her message more unsettling, not less. She didn't promise explosive revelations. She didn't accuse specific individuals of crimes. She emphasized review process and unanswered questions. And paradoxically, that made the story stronger. Because when someone claims to have all the answers, audiences often tune out. But when someone insists there are questions that haven't been addressed, people lean in. Critics still push back, of course. Some argued that the timing was manipulative, that releasing such a narrative during the holidays was designed to avoid immediate scrutiny. Others said it was irresponsible to reopen sensitive topics during a season meant for unity. But even those critics admitted one thing: the message didn't feel careless. The structure was too controlled, the language too measured, the pauses too deliberate. It felt like something that had been planned, not rushed, and that's why it lingered. Days later, people were still replaying clips, still debating tone and intent, still asking why this moment had hit so hard when similar claims in the past had faded quickly. The answer was simple. This wasn't delivered as breaking news. It was delivered as a warning, a reminder that unresolved questions don't disappear just because time passes. That moments of reflection can also be moments of accountability. By choosing Christmas week, Leavitt placed a burden on the audience, not to react emotionally, but to reflect honestly. And whether people agreed with her or not, that approach made the story impossible to dismiss. It didn't demand outrage. It invited unease. And in politics, unease often lasts much longer than anger. That's why this briefing didn't fade after holidays. That's why it kept resurfacing in conversations. And that's why, long after the decorations came down, the questions it raised were still hanging in the air, unanswered. So what now? That's the question echoing across Washington and across the country. As of this moment, there are no official charges, no documents released publicly for everyone to read, and no final conclusions announced. What exists instead are claims, ongoing reviews, unanswered questions, and mounting political pressure. But here's the reality many insiders won't say out loud. Politically, the impact has already landed. Karoline Leavitt forced a conversation that many in Washington hoped would remain buried forever. By raising questions instead of making accusations, she reopened 2020 not as a closed case, but as an unfinished chapter in the minds of millions of Americans. That alone is significant. For years, the dominant message was clear. The events of 2020 were settled, discussed, and resolved. Move on. Look forward. Don't question the process. But Leavitt disrupted that narrative. She didn't claim to have final answers. She challenged the idea that answers were no longer needed. And that shift matters. Because once people start questioning something they were told was settled, trust begins to change. Institutions that once relied on silence and authority now face scrutiny. Media outlets are being asked why some stories were pursued aggressively, while others were dismissed or ignored. Whether these files ultimately reveal misconduct or amount to nothing more than internal disagreements, the perception has already shifted. And perception in politics is power. Obama's legacy is a major part of that shift. For years, Barack Obama has been treated as a near untouchable figure in American politics, respected, protected, and often shielded from the kind of scrutiny applied to others. But now, even without direct accusations, his name is being discussed in a different context, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as part of a system whose influence may have extended far beyond his presidency. And that alone represents a major change. A new generation of political voices is no longer treating legacy figures as beyond question. They are asking uncomfortable things about networks, institutions, and long-term power, not just individual leaders. And Karoline Leavitt has placed herself right at the center of that shift. To her supporters, she looks like someone willing to challenge powerful systems others are afraid to touch. To her critics, she looks like a rising figure using ambiguity to stir controversy. Either way, her name is now tied to one of the most sensitive political debates of the last decade. This wasn't just a briefing. It was a warning shot, a signal that unresolved questions don't disappear simply because time passes. That political power doesn't end when terms do, and that narratives once considered untouchable can still be challenged. What happens next depends on what, if anything, emerges from these reviews. If documents are released, the debate will intensify. If nothing materializes, critics will argue this was all smoke without fire. But even then, the impact won't vanish. Because once trust is questioned, it doesn't snap back into place easily. The real takeaway isn't about one person, one administration, or one election. It's about whether Americans are willing to revisit uncomfortable moments, and whether institutions are prepared to answer for them. And that's why this story isn't over. Not next week, not next month, and not anytime soon. If more details emerge, this won't be remembered as a Christmas briefing. It will be remembered as the moment the past stopped staying quiet.